The Philistines are most often remembered as the sworn enemies of biblical heroes, the people from whom Goliath came and with whom the Israelite kings fought. But who were they really? Where did these people come from? On that narrow strip of land by the Mediterranean Sea? Their appearance coincided with the fall of entire empires and the crisis of the Bronze Age. Archaeology uncovers increasing details of their lives, cities, rituals, and household items. And the more we learn, the clearer it becomes. Behind the image of the enemy lies the history of one of the most fascinating peoples of antiquity. Welcome to the Amazing History channel, where together we explore the stories of peoples and ancient civilizations that often remain in the shadows of textbooks, but without which it's impossible to understand the past. Thanks to everyone who supports the channel with likes, comments, and subscriptions. That's exactly what gives me the strength and motivation to keep working. Anya, special thanks to our sponsors. Your support allows us to constantly improve the quality of our content.
If you want to join and support the project, all the links are below this video. Now let's get started. There's more to come.
When we talk about the Philistines, we immediately face a problem. They didn't leave any written legacy themselves. Everything we know about them is a mosaic of external accounts and archaeological findings. First of all, there are Egyptian texts on steles and bas-reliefs from the time of pharaohs Merneptah and Ramses III, which mention the people called Peliset, with whom the Egyptians fought fierce wars.
It is these people who are usually associated with the Philistines. Secondly, there is the Bible, but its picture is biased. The authors portray the Philistines as enemies of Israel, so such accounts should be viewed critically, separating mythologization from possible historical reality.
And finally, archaeology, the excavations of the cities of Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron have revealed a rich material culture. It is archaeology today that allows us to reconstruct the real life of the Philistines and not just their image in other people's texts. Before the Philistines occupied the coastal cities, the Canaanites lived here. The southern coast of the Levant was part of their world. A dense network of settlements, an economy focused on grapes and olives, and active trade. These lands were under strong Egyptian influence. Even during the New Kingdom era, the pharaohs kept garrisons here, built fortresses, and controlled key ports.
The Canaanite coast was a valuable link in trade. Goods were sent from here to Egypt and further south through it.
Crafts, trade, and cultural centers flourished here, and the cities competed with each other for resources and profitable routes. But by late 13th century before Christ, the familiar order began to collapse. Egyptian power weakened, international trade faltered, and new forces appeared on the horizon. It was against this backdrop that the settlers we now call the Philistines appeared. The late 13th and early 12th centuries before Christ marked a major crisis in Eastern Mediterranean history. Empires controlling trade and resources collapsed one after another. The reasons were complex. Droughts and famine, epidemics, invasions, and internal conflicts led to the collapse of all trade connections, weakened armies, and many cities simply disappeared from the map. Egyptian records from those years mention a mysterious group, the Sea Peoples. Behind this collective term were groups of settlers and warriors who moved by sea and land, destroying coastal cities. Among these raiders were the Peliset, whom we already know. Pharaoh Ramesses III faced them in a battle in the Nile Delta. Egypt held out at that time, but the Peliset did not disappear. Apparently, some of them settled on the southern coast of Canaan. Some scholars believe that they did this on their own, taking advantage of the chaos, while others think that they settled here by agreement with Egypt as its allies or vassals. One way or another, it was at this moment that the Philistines appeared on the historical stage. Archaeology shows quite confidently that the Philistines had roots in the Aegean Sea. In their cities, pottery has been found that is very similar in shape and ornamentation to late Mycenaean pottery. It was made from local clay, but according to foreign models. This means that the new inhabitants brought their familiar styles with them. Houses in Philistine settlements also stand out. They have round hearths in the center of the rooms. This is a characteristic feature of Aegean architecture unknown to the Canaanites. In kitchen refuse, archaeologists find especially many pig bones, which brings their diet closer to Aegean traditions and sharply distinguishes them from their neighbors, where pigs were hardly eaten. However, the theory of a purely Aegean origin is not the only one. Some researchers believe that the Philistines could have come through Cyprus, the Carian coast of Asia Minor, or Cilicia, mixing there with other groups of settlers. Their culture eventually became hybrid, Aegean elements intertwined with local Canaanite ones. Within just 1 or 2 generations, the distinction disappeared, but the earliest archaeological layers provide a rather clear imprint of outsiders. Having established themselves on the southern coast of the Levant, the Philistines formed an alliance of 5 main cities, the so-called Pentapolis. These were Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gath, Ekron, and Gaza. Each city had its own territory and its own authority, but together they formed a single political entity. At the head stood the so-called Seranim rulers, who are referred to in the biblical books as the lords or princes of the Philistines. Apparently, these were not kings in the usual sense, but military and political leaders who coordinated decisions, especially in matters of war and foreign policy. At the same time, the cities maintained their autonomy. They could compete with each other, but in case of a threat, they acted together. Such an alliance made the Philistines flexible and resilient. Unlike centralized kingdoms, they did not depend on a single ruler, and the defeat of one city did not mean the collapse of the entire people. That is why the Pentapolis, Pentapolis, was able to maintain its strength for several centuries, despite the pressure from neighboring states and empires. The Philistines quickly turned the coastline into an economically profitable region. Their cities stood at the crossroads, with trade passing through them from Egypt to the north, to Phoenicia and Syria and back, which made it possible to control customs duties and profit from transit. The foundation of their economy became vineyards and especially olive groves. Archaeologists in Ekron discovered an industrial district with dozens of oil presses, the largest complex in the ancient Levant. Olive oil was not only a food product, but also a trade commodity, a raw material for lamps, and even used in religious rituals. Philistine cities also practiced crafts and maritime trade. They could compete with the Phoenicians, although the latter gradually pushed them into secondary roles in international trade. Still, it was their developed economy that allowed the Philistines to maintain political independence for a long time. The Philistines went down in history not only as traders, but also as warriors. Their flat lands were ideal for the use of chariots, and for a long time, chariots were a symbol of the Philistines' military power. The biblical books repeatedly state the Israelites feared the Philistine chariots and heavy weapons. They also show the Philistines mastered iron working before their neighbors. While many still use bronze, this gave them a short-term edge in weapons and tools. Archaeological finds show a variety of spearheads, swords, and armor characteristic of their arsenal. But the military strength of the Philistines was not just about technology. They knew how to act in coordination, uniting the forces of their 5 cities and taking advantage of their geography. The coastal plains allowed them to control the routes to Jerusalem and deep into Palestine, which made them dangerous neighbors for the Israelite tribes. The Philistines almost always appear as anti-heroes in the biblical books, enemies of Israel. Battles with them are described in the stories of Samson, Saul, and David. It was from among them that the great Goliath emerged, symbolizing power and threat to the Israelites. Their relationship was more complex than it seemed. Besides wars, there were times of peace. The Philistines hired Israelites as mercenaries, formed alliances, and intermarriage among neighboring peoples was more common than expected. They also competed with the Phoenicians for trade routes and from time to time fell under the influence of Egypt. Later, as Assyria rose, the Philistine cities alternated between allying with and rebelling against a new superpower. Such a policy allowed them to maneuver, but ultimately led to the gradual loss of their independence. The Philistines' history is marked by rapid rises and swift falls. They settled on the coast, exploiting Egypt's decline and the fall of old powers. Their Pentapolis grew into a powerful hub where trade and warfare supported each other.
It was during this period that they were the most dangerous rivals for the Israelite tribes. By the 10th century before Christ,
the balance of power shifted. The Israelite kingdom of David and Solomon became more organized, and the Phoenician cities grew closer, which explained the Philistines. In maritime trade, their influence gradually diminished, and they lost control over part of the coastline and inland routes. In the 9th century, Syrian king Hazael destroyed Gad, a major city. This was the first serious blow to the Pentapolis. In the 8th-7th centuries before Christ, Syrian pressure was constant as cities fell under its control one by one. Occasional rebellions led to harsh punishment. At the end of the 7th century before Christ, Egypt defeated Gaza, and soon Nebuchadnezzar, the Noachies, destroyed Ashkelon and Ekron, taking their inhabitants into captivity. These events finally broke the independence of the Philistines. Their cities continued to exist, but only as ordinary provincial centers of large empires. Thus, by the 6th century before Christ, the people who had recently been a terrible enemy to their neighbors had dissolved into the new political realities. There was nothing absolutely unique in the religious life of the Philistines. They quickly adopted the cults common among the Canaanites. Their main deities were Baal, Asherah, and Dagon, whom the Bible especially often mentions as the Philistine god. Archaeologists find small temples and altars, as well as figurines associated with household cults. The everyday life of the Philistines is also revealed through archaeology. Their houses were distinguished by a layout with a characteristic round hearth in the center. They were engaged in viticulture, olive farming, pottery, and weaving. Their diet included bread, wine, meat, and especially pork, which set them apart from their neighbors, for whom the pig was considered an unclean animal. Festivals and feasts were important to them. The discovery of brightly painted ceramic vessels suggests that banquets were accompanied by wine and ritual ceremonies. This shows that, despite being called barbarians by outsiders, the Philistines had a rich cultural and economic life similar to other urban societies in the area. The Philistine cities persisted after the Assyrian and Babylonian conquests, but their identity gradually faded. Mass deportations, the resettlement of other peoples, and incorporation into the imperial system did their part. By the 6th century before Christ, the Philistine trace in sources nearly vanishes. Their descendants merged with other Levant inhabitants, Phoenicians, Canaanites, Mesopotamian settlers, so they blended into the Near Eastern Union and vanished. Today we know about them thanks to archaeology and ancient texts. The Philistines are an example of how a group of settlers was able to change the political and economic balance of an entire region for several centuries, but eventually lost their identity. They are remembered as enemies of Israel, but their real history is much richer and more complex.
well, that's all from me. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye, everyone.